RAF Bottisham, February 1944. The morning frost still clung to the edges of the runway when the first P-51 Mustang thundered into life. Its Merlin engine screamed, higher, sharper, more violent than before. Ground crews flinched at the pitch. It was not the same sound they'd known. The air shimmered with heat and gasoline vapor, and a pale chemist in a heavy overcoat stood at the edge of the tarmac, notebook in hand, watching. The pilot pushed the throttle. The engine coughed once, then roared into a banshee howl. The Mustang leapt forward, propeller clawing the air, its wingtips slicing the dawn like razors. Seconds later, it was climbing through the low fog, faster than the altimeter could track. 450 or 70, 490 miles an hour. Down below, the chemist exhaled. He had not designed engines. He had never flown a fighter. His battlefield was a laboratory. Beakers, burners, and ratios. But in that instant, as the sound of the Merlin's scream echoed across the frozen field, he knew what his formula had done. A year ago, the Luftwaffe had owned the sky. Now, because of a liquid that burned cleaner and hotter than anything before it, the hunters were about to become the hunted. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become the deadliest battlefield on Earth. Every morning, squadrons of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators climbed into thin air, bound for the industrial heart of Germany. Their orders were simple: cripple the factories, burn the oil, break the Reich's ability to fight. But the path to the target was a corridor of death. From the moment they crossed the Channel, the Luftwaffe was waiting. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s struck in coordinated waves, diving out of the sun, cutting through the bomber formations like wolves among cattle. Each mission meant dozens of aircraft lost, hundreds of men gone. For every ton of bombs dropped, another was paid in lives. The problem was range. Allied fighters could not escort the bombers all the way to their targets. The British Spitfire, fast and agile, had the heart of a sprinter, deadly for a few hundred miles, but short of breath beyond France. The American P-47 Thunderbolt, powerful and heavily armed, could go farther, but not far enough. When the escorts turned back, the bombers were left alone, and the Luftwaffe descended. The solution seemed to arrive in 1943 with a sleek new aircraft, the North American P-51 Mustang. Designed in a rush for the British, it was unlike any fighter before it. Long wings, laminar flow design, and a bubble canopy that made it seem almost futuristic. It was fast, stable, and elegant, but its early versions, powered by an American Allison engine, lacked high-altitude performance. Above 15,000 feet, it gasped for air, and the Luftwaffe ruled the upper sky. Then came a twist of history. British engineers suggested fitting the Mustang with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had carried Spitfires through the Battle of Britain. The combination was miraculous. The Mustang's range and aerodynamics, paired with the Merlin's supercharger, produced a fighter that could climb, turn, and dive with grace. It was the perfect machine, almost. The Merlin engine still had limits. At high altitudes, where the air thinned and the pressure dropped, the engine suffered from detonation, premature ignition of fuel caused by heat and compression. It robbed the aircraft of power and could destroy pistons in seconds. Engineers called it knock. Pilots called it death in the cylinder. The problem wasn't the engine. It was the fuel. Standard Allied aviation fuel at the time, the so-called 100-octane grade, was a marvel of wartime chemistry. But it wasn't enough. As the superchargers forced more air into the Merlin's cylinders, the pressure increased. The mixture exploded before the spark plugs fired. Engineers at Rolls-Royce, at the U.S. Army Air Forces, and at the British Air Ministry all knew the truth. If the war was to be won in the sky, They needed a fuel that could survive inside a storm. That challenge fell to a quiet man few soldiers ever knew. Dr. Harry Ricardo, one of Britain's foremost combustion chemists. Ricardo had spent his life studying how engines breathed, how flames behaved, and how energy could be tamed. His wartime laboratory in Shoreham-by-Sea was filled with glass flasks and steel cylinders, the smell of benzene and hot metal in the air. To most, it looked like alchemy. But in that small room, Ricardo and his team were solving one of the greatest mechanical puzzles of the age. They discovered that by blending high-aromatic hydrocarbons, like toluene and iso-octane, with carefully measured doses of tetraethyl lead, they could create a fuel that resisted detonation far beyond the limits of standard aviation gasoline. The result was a mix rated at 150 octane. Though technically it wasn't octane at all. It was a rating of resistance to premature combustion. At first, the Air Ministry doubted it. The new mixture was expensive, volatile, and required special refining. But as reports of bomber losses mounted, hesitation turned to urgency. The chemists promised an increase of 15 to 20% in engine power, without any mechanical modification. It was, in effect, free horsepower. Tests began quietly at Rolls-Royce and at American bases in England. The Merlin engines responded with fury. Boost pressures climbed from plus 18 to plus 125 pounds. Horsepower jumped past 1,700. The Mustang's speed leapt beyond anything seen in piston engine aviation. 480, even 490 miles an hour in level flight. The chemists had turned liquid science into speed, and the war, for the first time, tilted toward the Allies in the air. But behind the triumph lay questions of control, risk, and secrecy, because no one was entirely sure what that new fuel might do to the engines or to the men who flew them. In the winter of 1943, the Allied air campaign teetered on the edge of failure. Bomber Command was losing planes faster than factories could replace them. The daylight raids over Germany were bleeding the 8th Air Force white. Inside command rooms from High Wycombe to Washington, one phrase began to echo. "We are running out of sky." That was when the chemists entered the war. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment and Ricardo's Shoreham laboratory, the new high-performance fuel, known only by its military code 100-150 grade, underwent brutal testing. Engines were run until they glowed orange, piston rings melted, and gauges shattered under pressure. Every failure revealed something. Another fraction of a second before detonation. Another step toward the perfect mix. The secret was not just more octane, but better control of combustion. Traditional 100-octane fuel relied heavily on isooctane and lead tetraethyl to resist knock. But Ricardo's team pushed beyond chemistry's comfort zone. They introduced aromatic compounds, benzene, toluene, xylene, molecules with stable ring structures that resisted spontaneous explosion under compression. Combined with optimized ratios of alkylates and lead additives, the new mixture didn't just burn, it flowed like electricity. At 25,000 feet, where engines struggled for breath, this fuel remained smooth and stable. It allowed the Merlin 66 and later Merlin 70 engines to reach unheard-of boost pressures of plus 25 pounds per square inch, forcing more air and fuel into the cylinders without detonation. Power jumped from 1,460 horsepower to nearly 1,120. It was, in engineering terms, the difference between life and death. Still, introducing it into combat wasn't simple. There were logistical nightmares. The fuel required separate storage, special filtration, and constant supervision to prevent contamination. A single misblend could destroy an entire squadron's engines. American refinery engineers at Anglo-Iranian, Standard Oil, and Shell Mex were sworn to secrecy. Tankers carrying the volatile blend crossed the Atlantic under armed convoy, Their manifests disguised as aviation fluid. In early 1944, small quantities reached testing fields at RAF Bottisham Down and USAF Bottisham. The pilots were skeptical. Many had learned the hard way that experimental often meant dangerous. The engineers, pale from sleepless nights, warned them. The engines could overheat, superchargers might seize. But the war was losing patience, and so were the men fighting it. The first test flights were astonishing. When pilots pushed the throttle forward, the Mustang surged as if it had grown another engine. Climb rates shot upward. Acceleration felt instantaneous. The sound of the Merlin changed pitch, a sharper, hungrier scream, as if the aircraft itself had come alive. And the numbers didn't lie. At 25,000 feet, the P-51D reached nearly 490 miles per hour, matching the dive speeds of the fastest German fighters and outrunning them in level flight. The 100-150 fuel allowed pilots to use war emergency power for longer bursts without destroying the engine. In short, the Mustang had become something entirely new. A predator that could chase its prey across the sky and never tire. When word reached 8th Air Force headquarters, the reaction was immediate. A secret order went out under the code name Combat Grade Introduction. The new fuel would be distributed to frontline units, but under strict classification. Ground crews were told only that it was high test. Pilots knew it as the hot stuff. Officially, it didn't exist. At the same time, Rolls-Royce and Packard engineers fine-tuned the Merlin supercharger gear ratios to take advantage of the higher octane. The synergy was perfect. Chemistry meeting mechanics at the edge of destruction. By February 1944, entire groups, the 357th Fighter Group, the 4th, and the 352nd Blue Noses were running on the new mixture. Escort missions stretched deeper into Germany, reaching Berlin itself. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe found enemy fighters where none should have been. The radio calls from German pilots began to change. Sie sind überall. Sie sind schneller. They are everywhere. They are faster. They weren't wrong. The Mustangs were no longer just escorts. They were hunters. Their extended range and impossible speed meant no bomber formation was ever alone again. And back in the laboratories of England, the chemists watched the data flow in. Temperature readings, boost pressures, kill ratios. They rarely spoke of victory. They spoke of stability curves, flame fronts, and aromatic yields. But deep down, they knew. Their liquid formula had rewritten the physics of flight. From glass flasks to dogfights over Berlin, chemistry had become strategy. The new fuel had turned machines into miracles. But war never gives gifts freely. And soon, those miracles would be tested under fire, in the skies where science met death head-on. They said you could feel the difference before you even left the ground. When the throttle opened on a P-51 running the new 150-grade fuel, the Merlin's growl deepened into something almost alive. Not mechanical, but animal. The vibration came through the seat, up the spine, into the hands. The plane didn't climb. It lunged. For the pilots of the 8th Air Force, it was more than horsepower. It was relief. They had flown the old missions, long escort runs to Bremen or Regensburg, turning back while the bombers kept going, forced to listen to the screams of men dying over the radio. They knew the helplessness of watching from the edge of range. Now, that helplessness was gone. In the cockpit, the boost gauge spun higher than it ever had. The airspeed climbed past redline, and the Mustang didn't shake or cough. It purred. Pilots described the sensation as power without resistance. At 25,000 feet, they could dive, climb, and turn at will. Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group called it flying unleashed. Others joked that it made them reckless. You forgot to be afraid. But the truth was simpler. For the first time, the Allied pilots were faster, higher, and stronger than the Luftwaffe. Every mission brought confirmation. They chased Bf-109Gs into dives and caught them. They turned inside FW-190s, something no Allied pilot had dared to claim before. The Mustangs that returned to base carried the proof in black gun camera film. Flashes of silver and smoke trailing into the clouds. When ground crews drained the tanks, the new fuel smelled different, sweeter, aromatic, almost floral. To the men on the flight line, that scent meant survival. It was the smell of victory in liquid form. The 150-grade blend wasn't magic. It was chemistry sharpened to a knife's edge. At its core was a truth that engineers had long suspected but rarely tested, that fuel could be engineered as precisely as any mechanical part. Standard 100-octane fuel reached its limit at about 118 pounds of boost. Beyond that, the mixture detonated prematurely. Shock waves inside the cylinder fighting against the piston instead of pushing it. Ricardo's mixture changed that equation by using aromatic hydrocarbons, primarily toluene, benzene, and xylene, bonded to resist thermal breakdown, and combining them with carefully dosed tetraethyl lead and oxygen stabilizers. The fuel burned slower, cooler, and more predictably. The flame front moved across the combustion chamber in perfect synchronization with the piston's motion. In mechanical terms, it was a symphony. The result was a power curve unlike anything previously seen. The Merlin's supercharger could now operate at +125 pounds boost, with manifold pressures exceeding 70 inches of mercury, enough to tear apart lesser engines. Instead, the Mustangs thrived. Engineers measured thrust gains of 20% at takeoff and 15% at altitude. That translated directly into climb rate and top speed, from 437 mph to nearly 490 mph in level flight, depending on altitude and humidity. But it wasn't only performance. It was endurance. The higher octane fuel also allowed leaner mixtures at cruise power, extending range. That meant deeper escort missions, all the way to Berlin and back, without sacrificing protection. Ricardo later described it humbly. We learned that fuel could be as much an engine as the engine itself. In that statement lay the essence of the innovation. The war had forced chemistry and engineering to merge. The 150 grade wasn't just a better gasoline, it was a redefinition of what power meant in flight. The introduction of 150-octane fuel was not inevitable. When the first reports reached Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory and General Jimmy Doolittle, they were cautious. Higher octane meant higher stress on engines, logistics, and pilots. There were fears of detonation under heat, of superchargers failing mid-air, of entire squadrons grounded by mechanical disasters. But Doolittle understood risk. He had led the Tokyo raid with less certainty than this. When he saw the data, the power curves, the range charts, he made his decision in one line. If it works, we win faster. Under his command, the U.S. 8th Air Force authorized full deployment of the new fuel to selected Mustang units in early 1944. The RAF followed quietly, integrating the blend into Spitfire Mickey-9 and Tempest squadrons. It was a secret the Allies guarded like a weapon. Pilots were instructed not to discuss the new performance publicly. If captured, they were to claim engine tuning, not fuel modification. The Germans would not learn of the chemistry behind their defeat until the war was over. There was another kind of leadership, too, in the laboratories. Ricardo and his colleagues faced their own ethical questions. They were not soldiers, yet their discoveries made killing more efficient. Some called it the chemistry of death. Ricardo disagreed. To him, every increase in power meant fewer bombers lost, fewer sons who wouldn't come home. When the first reports of reduced bomber losses reached Shoreham, the scientists didn't celebrate. They stood in silence. The data spoke for itself. 50% fewer aircraft lost on deep strike missions. The fuel was working. Leadership in that moment was not found in medals or command posts. It was found in the courage to take a scientific gamble and win. In the air, the difference was audible. On the ground, it was measurable. But across the front, the effect was unmistakable. The Allies had seized control of the sky, powered not by steel or wings, but by chemistry itself. And far across the Channel, the Luftwaffe began to notice that something was terribly wrong with the balance of speed. In the skies over Germany, 1944 began with confusion. For years, Luftwaffe pilots had flown with certainty. They knew the speeds, the ranges, the climb rates of every Allied aircraft. When a bomber formation appeared on radar, they calculated intercept points to the minute. They knew how long it would take to reach the enemy, and when to expect the escorts to turn for home. Then, suddenly, the math stopped working. By March, reports poured into Jagdgeschwader headquarters. Allied fighters were appearing hundreds of kilometers deeper into Germany, above Leipzig, Brunswick, even Berlin itself, long after their fuel should have run out. Pilots swore the new Mustangs climbed faster, dove steeper, and somehow seemed to accelerate in level flight. At first, intelligence officers assumed a new aircraft type, but captured wrecks told a stranger story. These were the same P-51Ds the Luftwaffe had faced for months. Same propellers, same engines, same guns. Yet, something in them had changed. Veteran German ace Adolf Galland, commander of fighter forces in the West, noted bitterly, the Mustang was suddenly untouchable. They flew as if possessed. Focke-Wulf engineers measured combat reports and found their FW-190A8 fighters losing speed margins they once held. The new Mustangs were reaching nearly 730 km/h, 490 mph in dives, speeds that strained German airframes to the point of failure. Luftwaffe pilots called them Die Silbernen Teufel, the Silver Devils. Fuel was never suspected. No one imagined that a chemical formula could produce such dominance. The Luftwaffe tried to compensate by switching tactics: head-on attacks, night operations, rocket armament, but it was already too late. German losses in daylight defense rose by 60% in 3 months. The enemy wasn't just faster, it was everywhere. The Allied command quickly recognized what the chemists had given them. With 150-grade fuel, the P-51 became the first fighter that could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. More than 1,500 miles round trip. For the 8th Air Force, that single change transformed strategy. Before, bomber formations had to fight their way across the continent alone for the final hour of every mission. Now, they were never unguarded. Mustangs prowled above, below, and beyond the bomber stream, their engines screaming at war emergency boost, their tanks filled with the high-octane blend that made such endurance possible. The effect on losses was immediate and measurable. In early 1944, the average bomber casualty rate on deep strike missions was nearly 8% per raid. By summer, it had fallen below 2%. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed not in great battles, but by attrition. Every interception costing them more aircraft than they could replace. Even the strategic bombing campaign itself changed character. With continuous escort, raids could strike targets deep inside the Reich, Leipzig, Merseburg, and the oil refineries of Ploiești, the very sources of Germany's fuel supply. Each successful strike starved the Luftwaffe further, grounding its own fighters for lack of gasoline. The irony was poetic. Chemistry had given the Allies power and taken it from their enemy. At the operational level, the 150-grade fuel forced a complete rethinking of engine management. Pilots learned to switch boost levels, lean mixtures, and time climbs with scientific precision. Ground crews became chemists in uniform, testing density, adjusting carburetors, checking plugs. The battlefield had moved from mud and metal to molecules and pressure. For the Allied war machine, this was more than an advantage. It was proof that science, properly directed, relentlessly applied, could decide the outcome of a global conflict. War always demands invention, but it also asks a quieter question. At what cost? In laboratories from London to Dayton, the men and women refining 150-grade fuel worked surrounded by charts, not corpses. Yet they knew exactly what their formulas meant. Every increase in octane, every degree of detonation resistance, translated to more speed and more deaths. Dr. Harry Ricardo was often uneasy about that. He had entered the war determined to apply science for defense, not destruction. But in 1943, the moral line blurred. The bombers that survived because of his work carried their own loads of death to Germany. The chemist understood that his success would kill thousands, but also save thousands more. He once wrote in a private letter, "We are not inventing death. We are redistributing it toward an end that must come sooner." That was the strange calculus of wartime science. Every improvement brought both mercy and devastation. Yet without it, the war might have stretched on for years, claiming millions more. The pilots felt that paradox too. Many described their new power with awe and discomfort. Some refused to use maximum boost unless under direct threat, fearing engine damage or moral excess. Others used it without hesitation, knowing what losing the sky would mean for men on the ground. Looking back, historians often credit generals, aircraft designers, or tacticians for the air war's turning point. But the truth lies deeper, in glass beakers, fuel drums, and the quiet courage of minds that dared to break nature's limits for survival's sake. The chemists who brewed that volatile mixture never saw combat, but their fingerprints were on every dogfight that followed. They proved that wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with understanding. By the spring of 1944, the world's most advanced air force was no longer German. It was Allied, powered by a colorless liquid, born in secrecy, refined in fear, and unleashed through the roar of 1,000 Merlin engines. But that power was about to meet its moment of reckoning. The test that would show whether chemistry could truly win a War March 6, 1944, Berlin. The morning sky above Germany was steel gray, cold, and unforgiving. Below, 730 American bombers droned eastward, the largest daylight raid in history. Their target, the factories and rail yards of the German capital. For the Luftwaffe, it was unthinkable. No bomber force had ever reached Berlin in daylight and survived. The Reich's fighter groups, JG-11, JG-26, JG-300, scrambled from bases across central Germany. Hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing hard to intercept. They expected what they had always faced before: slow bombers, tired escorts turning for home. But when they broke through the cloud layer, they saw something new: silver shapes, slender, gleaming, and fast, already circling high above the bomber's stream. P-51 Mustangs, dozens of them cruising easily at 28,000 feet, contrails arcing across the sky like drawn swords. The German pilots couldn't believe it. The Mustangs shouldn't have been there. No Allied fighter had the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. Yet here they were, unshakable, engines howling with a tone sharper than anything the Luftwaffe had heard before. Those engines were running on 150-grade fuel, and that morning, chemistry would rewrite air warfare. The first engagement came over Hanover, where a group of Bf-109 G6s dove head-on into the bomber formation. The Mustangs dropped their tanks, throttled to emergency boost, and went after them. The Merlins screamed. In seconds, the American fighters were climbing nearly vertically, something previously impossible at this altitude. The Germans pulled hard to escape, but the Mustangs were already above them, rolling into the attack. At plummered 25 pounds of boost, the Merlin produced nearly 1,720 horsepower. The Mustangs tore through the formation, guns flashing, contrails twisting like smoke. One Luftwaffe ace later wrote, "They were faster in the climb, faster in the dive, and faster in level flight. Our advantage was gone in a single week." By the time the bombers reached Berlin, the sky was chaos. Dogfights raged from 20,000 feet to the deck. The Mustangs hunted relentlessly, not just defending the bombers, but chasing German fighters miles from the formation. They flew like predators unleashed, confident that their engines would hold, their power unlimited. For the first time, the Luftwaffe broke. Entire squadrons scattered instead of pressing the attack. German airfields were overrun by their own retreating fighters, low on fuel, desperate to land. Back at Bottisham, the Mustang squadrons returned hours later, engines scorched, paint blistered from heat, but triumphant. Not one bomber group had been wiped out. The losses were minimal. The impossible had been achieved. The first successful daylight raid on Berlin with full bomber return. The message sent to London that afternoon was brief. Mission complete. Escort maintained entire route. Enemy resistance heavy. Losses light. It was the understated report of a miracle. When technicians inspected the Mustangs after landing, they found the engines blackened but intact. Cylinder pressures had exceeded safe limits. Oil temperatures had hit redline. Yet the engines had survived. Proof that the new fuel was not just potent, but stable under punishment. Ricardo's mixture had held its promise. Word spread quickly through Allied command. In the mess halls and planning rooms, one phrase began to circulate among pilots: "We own the sky now." From that day forward, the Luftwaffe would never recover. Their ace pilots were dead or grounded, their fuel depots bombed, their morale shattered. The P-51, once a newcomer, was now the symbol of Allied dominance, the silver demon that haunted every German cockpit. But for the men who built and flew them, that victory carried weight. Many had seen the burned wrecks below, the black smoke columns marking the price of every mission. They knew this triumph was not clean. It was the cost of innovation measured in fire. As one pilot from the 357th Fighter Group wrote in his logbook after Berlin, "The fuel worked. The speed was real, and today we finally outran death." That day marked the beginning of the end of the Luftwaffe's supremacy. But the real turning point, the moment the world understood what the 150-grade fuel truly meant, would come in the weeks that followed, when the hunters became the hunted across all of Germany's skies. After the raid on Berlin, the sky itself seemed to shift. The Germans felt it first, not in reports or numbers, but in silence. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe no longer dictated the rhythm of air combat. The hunters had become the hunted. Throughout spring 1944, every dawn over Germany began the same way. The low rumble of distant engines, the glint of silver in the high sun, and then the scream. The Mustangs came not in small escort flights, but in swarms, sweeping hundreds of miles ahead of the bombers, striking at airfields, trains, convoys, even radar towers. Their fuel tanks, filled with the volatile 150-grade blend, carried them farther than any pilot had dreamed. They could patrol Berlin at noon and be back over the Channel by dusk. The war had found a new rhythm. Faster, higher, unstoppable. By April 1944, Luftwaffe Command was running out of options. Their Messerschmitt 109Gs and Focke-Wulf 190As, once the pride of German engineering, were now outclassed in every measurable way. Their engines, running on 87 to 100 octane fuel, could not produce comparable boost. Even the new BMW 801D2 power plants, forced beyond design limits, began tearing themselves apart mid-flight. Pilots tried to compensate through tactics. Diving attacks, ambushes from the sun. But the Mustangs were always waiting, already higher, already faster. The 8th Air Force began calling them Skykeepers. In the archives of the German Air Ministry, a single memo survives from April 17, 1944, written by a weary technical officer. "The enemy's fighters are superior in both endurance and power. Our measures cannot equal theirs. Suggest withdrawal from central airspace." It was the bureaucratic language of defeat. At Steeple Morden, England, Captain John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group led his flight into what became known as the longest escort. The target, Augsburg, nearly 700 miles away. No Allied fighter had ever covered that distance in a single mission. But Meyer's Mustangs, fueled with the new blend, made the trip, and returned with half their tanks still sloshing. Somewhere over southern Germany, the pilots realized they were rewriting physics. Their gauges read impossible numbers: 400 Zehnths, 175, 490 miles per hour. The throttle still had room to move. Even the superchargers, notorious for strain at high boost, hummed evenly. When they spotted a group of Bf-109s below, they dropped through the haze like meteors. The German pilots didn't even turn to fight. They couldn't. The speed difference was too great. Within seconds, the Mustangs were among them. Cannon flashes, trails of fire, black smoke folding into the clouds. That engagement lasted 6 minutes. The Luftwaffe lost 12 aircraft. The Allies lost none. In the weeks that followed, those scenes repeated across the continent. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, not through grand battles, but through a steady drain of men, planes, and fuel. Each Mustang that returned to base had one more victory stencil on its nose and one less opponent in the sky. By May 1944, the statistics were brutal. German fighter losses, 100 aircraft destroyed. Allied bomber losses, down by 75%. Escort penetration depth increased from 400 to over 1,000 miles. The chemists who had made it possible remained silent. In secret correspondence, Ricardo's assistant wrote, "We read the reports like doctors reading vital signs. Every mission returning means another equation solved. And yet, within the calm precision of their success, there was awe. Awe that the difference between victory and extinction could come down to molecules, measured in hundredths of a ratio." The final confirmation came in June 1944, during Operation Overlord. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, squadrons of Mustangs and Thunderbolts circled overhead in endless relays. Their fuel, the same 150 grade blend, allowed them to remain on station for hours. No German air attack ever reached the invasion fleet. The sky over France belonged entirely to the Allies. For Doolittle, for Ricardo, for every pilot who had once feared running out of range, that was the moment everything changed. The war in Europe had turned. Germany's lifeline, its air defense, had been severed. The chemist's formula had done what no bomb could. It had made freedom faster. After each mission, the pilots often disembarked in silence. There was no cheering, no grand speeches. They knew they were witnessing the end, not just of a campaign, but of an era. The sound of the Merlin engine at full power was now the anthem of victory. In the control rooms, commanders traced red and blue lines across vast maps of Europe. The blue lines, Allied air corridors, stretched unbroken from the Channel to the Polish border. The red, Luftwaffe defenses, had thinned to nothing. The war had been won in the space between spark and detonation, between chemistry and courage. When Dr. Ricardo received word of the results, he reportedly said nothing for several minutes. Then quietly, "It worked as it had to. No more." He never took public credit. He never sought it. But history would remember what he had truly created. Not just faster fuel, but a bridge between science and victory. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a fighting force. And in the silence left behind, one truth became clear. The war in the air had not been won by engines, wings, or bullets. It had been won by combustion perfected. By the summer of 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to a new force, silent, silver, and relentless, powered by chemistry. Every sunrise saw waves of P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and Spitfires sweeping across the continent. They didn't fight for air superiority anymore. They maintained it. In the wake of the Berlin raids and the Allied victories that followed, the Luftwaffe's decline became irreversible. Airfields once crowded with Messerschmitts now stood empty. Mechanics stripped wrecks for parts. Training schools closed for lack of fuel and aircraft. The few surviving aces flew outdated planes on missions that no longer had a purpose. The Allies had done what seemed impossible only a year earlier. They had achieved permanent dominance of the air. But that victory wasn't born of one weapon or one machine. It was born of an invisible substance, the 150 octane aviation fuel, that turned technology into an instrument of inevitability. The numbers told the story more clearly than any speech. Between March and August 1944, Allied bomber losses fell from 8% per mission to under 2%. In the same span, German fighter losses reached catastrophic levels, over 1,600 aircraft destroyed in air combat. More than that, the Luftwaffe lost its most irreplaceable asset, its pilots. The once feared veterans of 1940, the men who had fought over London, Moscow, and Stalingrad, were gone. In their place came hastily trained recruits, sent aloft with a few dozen flight hours and no hope of survival. They climbed into the sky and never returned. German command knew it. In an August 1944 report to Hitler, Adolf Galland wrote with brutal honesty, "We have no fuel, no experienced men, and no answer to the enemy's range and power. The air war in the West is lost." He was right. Everywhere the Allies advanced, the same pattern repeated. Convoys moved unchallenged across the Channel. Trains in France and Belgium rolled under constant aerial cover. The Wehrmacht, once masters of blitzkrieg, were now pinned to the ground, unable to maneuver without being seen, tracked, and destroyed from above. The 150-grade fuel had done more than increase speed. It had reshaped logistics, command, and morale. Now, the air was not a battlefield. It was an environment the Allies controlled completely. At Ricardo's laboratory in Shoreham, the news arrived in dry, technical summaries. Reports of sustained operational stability at full boost, significant reduction in detonation failure, and continued positive performance trends. But hidden in those clinical lines was the weight of something enormous. Every stability confirmation meant pilots coming home alive. Every positive performance trend meant fewer bombers burning in the sky. The chemists never saw the dogfights, but they understood them better than anyone. They knew what it meant to push an engine beyond its limit, to make steel, fuel, and fire cooperate against the laws of physics. They had done it not for glory, but out of necessity. For them, victory wasn't celebration. It was silence. The kind of silence that comes when the crisis has passed and the world keeps spinning. In the United States, refineries worked day and night to sustain the flow of high-octane fuel. Each gallon required careful blending, using aromatics derived from scarce crude stocks and additives refined under military supervision. Every drum that reached the front was a triumph of engineering and logistics. Chemistry scaled to the size of continents. Meanwhile, in Germany, the opposite was happening. The same Allied aircraft, now powered by a 150-grade fuel, were systematically bombing synthetic fuel plants at Launa, Merseburg, and Politz. By September, the Reich's fuel output had collapsed by 90%. Without gasoline, even the surviving Luftwaffe units could not fly. The final irony was cruel. The war that chemistry had helped to sustain was now being ended by chemistry itself. By autumn, the Allied pilots spoke of their missions differently. The thrill was gone, replaced by inevitability. When they saw German aircraft, they didn't see equals anymore. They saw remnants. The once deadly dogfights had become executions. In the officers' mess, one pilot from the 352nd Fighter Group summed it up in a single line. They stopped fighting back. That's when we knew the war was already over. He was right. The war in the air had been decided long before Berlin fell. Decided in laboratories, in refineries, in minds that had dared to ask, what if we could go faster? And yet, behind every victory lay the quiet unease of those who understood its source. Because when science wins a war, it also changes the world that follows. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world turned quiet again. The skies that had once burned with contrails and cannon fire were suddenly empty. Only the echoes remained. The Mustangs that had ruled Europe sat in neat rows on English airfields, their engines silent, their tanks drained. The war that their fuel had helped to win was over. But the legacy of that invisible liquid had just begun. The 150-grade blend was more than a wartime curiosity. It was the first glimpse of a new age, the scientific war, fought and won not by armies alone, but by intellect, chemistry, and control of energy itself. In Britain, the Air Ministry quietly classified the entire project. Official histories credited engine improvement and supercharger refinement. The truth, that the decisive edge had come from a chemical innovation, was buried for decades. The formula, the refinery processes, and the test data were locked away in vaults marked Most Secret, Fuel Efficiency Division. Dr. Harry Ricardo, the man whose theories had enabled it, returned to civilian work with little recognition. He never spoke publicly about the wartime experiments. His research company continued studying combustion for peacetime engines, cars, locomotives, even marine vessels. But those who knew him said he carried the war quietly within him. He had seen what science could do when pushed to its limits, and what it could destroy. In the United States, the legacy took a different shape. Refineries that had once produced 150-grade aviation fuel turned their research toward high-octane automotive gasoline, laying the foundation for post-war performance and industry. The techniques pioneered to stabilize aromatic hydrocarbons, benzene, toluene, xylene, became the blueprint for modern petrochemical engineering. Every highway, every jetliner, every combustion engine that followed carried traces of the same wartime discovery. It was as if a fraction of that 1944 formula still burned somewhere inside the machines of peace. But there was another, more profound inheritance: the idea that knowledge itself could be a weapon. The air war had proven that mastery of chemistry, physics, and engineering could determine the fate of nations. From radar to rocketry, from code-breaking to nuclear research, the pattern was the same. Those who understood the invisible, the atomic, the molecular, the electromagnetic, held the power to shape history. In Germany, captured documents revealed the irony of their defeat. Their scientists had known about higher octane fuels, even experimented with 110 and 120 grade mixtures, but lacked the refining capacity and additives to produce them at scale. They had been beaten not by machines, but by industrial chemistry. For the men who had fought in the air, the realization came later. In peacetime, when they flew surplus Mustangs for air shows or test flights, many noted how docile the aircraft seemed on ordinary fuel. Slower, quieter, almost tame. The fire was gone. The war had ended, and so had the chemistry that gave it wings. When historians looked back decades later, they struggled to find the right words for what the chemists of 1943 had done. It wasn't invention in the traditional sense. It was optimization at the edge of catastrophe. Every ratio, every molecule, every drop of 150-grade fuel had been tuned to operate on the brink of destruction. And somehow it had held. That balancing act between brilliance and disaster became the unspoken hallmark of the scientific age that followed. Jet engines, nuclear reactors, rockets, all owed something to that wartime courage to test the limits of what could burn. The chemist's formula had been a weapon, yes, but it was also a promise that understanding could transform survival into progress. By the late 1940s, the roar of piston engines gave way to the whine of jets. The Mustang, once a miracle of its time, became a relic of a vanished world. Yet in every turbine and every contrail above the earth, echoes of that 150-grade discovery remained. Invisible, precise, eternal. The men who had flown them aged quietly, and the chemists who had built their power slipped into history. But their work had done more than win a war. It had proven that knowledge, when paired with courage, could change the speed of destiny itself. The war had ended in fire. Peace began in fuel. And somewhere, in the soft hum of every modern engine, you can still hear the whisper of the mixture that once turned Mustangs into 490 Mahitmaf demon hunters. History often remembers the noise of war, the thunder of engines, the flash of guns, the roar of victory. But sometimes, the greatest revolutions happen in silence, in the quiet hum of a laboratory, the slow turn of a dial, the invisible spark inside a cylinder. The chemist who changed the war never led a squadron, never flew a mission, never fired a shot. Yet his creation made the difference between defeat and survival. He turned liquid into power, numbers into wings, chemistry into destiny. The 150-grade fuel did more than make planes faster. It reminded the world that progress often comes from places unseen, from the patient hands of those who work without glory, guided not by fame, but by necessity. In every drop of that volatile mixture was the story of thousands. Engineers, refinery workers, mechanics, all risking failure so that others might live. When the war ended, the laboratories fell silent again. The beakers cooled, the equations were locked away, but their echoes lingered. In the jet age, in the atomic age, in the modern world shaped by those who once believed that perfection could exist inside a flame, the Mustang became a symbol, not just of speed or victory, but of what happens when intellect meets desperation. When courage takes the shape of invention, when the difference between life and death is measured in chemistry. Today, those aircraft sit in museums, polished, preserved, peaceful. Their engines no longer scream across Europe, but if you stand close enough, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of the Merlin's roar, fed by that impossible fuel, defying gravity, defying limits, defying time itself. Because in the end, the story of the Mustang isn't about horsepower or speed. It's about the moment humanity learned that the smallest change, a fraction of a formula, a spark of an idea, can alter the course of history. And that sometimes, the most powerful weapon in war is understanding.